Slavery has always been a part of human society. There's no denying that. But the term slavery was not an everyday word in ancient cultures. It was coined in its modern form in the late Middle Ages, combining various linguistic roots, meaning bondage and ownership. And because there's no single definitive way to pinpoint the exact beginning of slavery in history, we're going to have to strive to get as close as possible and examine how slavery has been practiced and perceived throughout the ages. But be warned, by the end of this discussion, you might just feel like a slave yourself, as ancient slavery was nothing compared to the realities of today. So watch with caution and loosen the shackles. The concept of slavery, a term historically used to describe the ownership and control of individuals for labor or other purposes, is an ancient one, with origins that trace back to early human societies. However, an exploration of prehistoric societies reveals intriguing aspects of social organization and labor distribution. In prehistoric times, the primary focus was on survival and community cohesion. The notion of slavery as we understand it today did not exist in the same form. Labor was likely more communal and based on mutual necessity rather than ownership or coercion. Archaeological findings, such as tools and settlement structures from the Paleolithic era, provide some insight into prehistoric social hierarchies and labor roles. These artifacts, discovered across Europe, Asia, and Africa, suggest a division of labor that emphasized cooperation and shared responsibilities. However, it is important to note that these discoveries do not necessarily indicate a prehistoric version of slavery. And with the evidence suggesting little to no references to enslaved individuals in prehistoric times, I still have a gut feeling saying there's something more beneath the surface. Thus, we have to go deeper. In ancient societies like Egypt and Mesopotamia, slavery was often justified through various cultural, economic, and pseudoscientific theories, portraying slaves as property rather than human beings with rights. However, these were human constructs, not natural states. A simple individual's status was heavily regulated and controlled, and any inconsideration from the norm was often justified through societal ideologies. Slavery was expected to be a normalized part of society, reinforcing social hierarchies and economic structures. To be honest, the ancient society's justifications for slavery sound more like something from a dystopian novel, and that's why we definitely need to take a look at them. One theory that gained significant traction was the concept of the natural hierarchy. This theory, primarily attributed to ancient philosophers, stated that certain individuals were inherently suited to be slaves due to their supposed innate characteristics. To enforce this hierarchy, societies were structured to maintain the dominance of specific classes over others. To uphold this system, more extreme measures were implemented. For example, strict legal codes. Strict legal codes involve the codification of slavery, establishing laws that define the rights of slave owners and the limited freedoms of slaves to maintain social order. Yikes. Other measures, suggested by the ruling classes, included forced labor and harsh punishments. The natural hierarchy theory was so deeply ingrained in societal thought that it was still being taught in European institutions as late as the 18th century. It was only with the progress of modern human rights theories and the abolitionist movements that the theory began to be seriously questioned and eventually discarded from the societal realm. Someone should have just sent the ancient societies a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Problem solved. By the way, the Universal Declaration was most likely written in 1948. Go surprise your friend with a fun fact, if you have one. While ancient societies brought some justification to the situation, it still feels like we need to dig deeper into the history of these oppressive systems called slavery. And what better place to explore next than the good old Middle Ages, where around every shady corner, there might be some exploitative labor practices going on. In the Middle Ages, the understanding of social hierarchy was significantly different from today's perspective, and the concept of slavery was heavily influenced by the works of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers who believed that human societies were composed of different classes with predetermined roles: the nobility, clergy, free citizens, and slaves, each believed to be intrinsically linked to the four classical elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and their balance was thought to determine the stability and prosperity of a society. Slaves, according to this theory, were considered to embody the more rigid and controllable elements, making them suitable for subservient roles. This belief had significant implications for the treatment and regulation of slaves in medieval society. Moreover, this understanding also shaped the approach to labor and ownership. The inherent nature of slaves was believed to affect their productivity and loyalty. Masters often prescribed strict routines and harsh penalties to discipline and improve their slaves, such as enforced labor schedules and limited personal freedoms. This belief, combined with the societal expectations of hierarchical order, led to the institutionalization of slavery in various forms across medieval Europe. But the treatment of slaves in the Middle Ages varied, with some masters advocating for fair treatment and protection under feudal laws, while others imposed more extreme measures such as physical punishment or complete control over personal lives. But do not be fooled. Slavery was not universally accepted in all medieval societies, and the more humane treatment of slaves was typically reserved for higher status individuals who could afford such leniency. Lower-class slaves who were deemed unruly or disobedient were viewed with suspicion and often subjected to harsh punishments. The Church, wielding significant influence over societal norms, considered the fair treatment of slaves as a moral obligation. Yet paradoxically, it also sanctioned slavery under certain conditions, reflecting the complex interplay between religious doctrine and economic interests. These methods were believed to reinforce the natural hierarchy and maintain the productivity and stability of the feudal system. The fear of legal repercussions and severe punishments led many slaves to comply silently, contributing to a culture of submission and silence around the harsh realities of slavery. The Church's influence further reinforced these norms, associating obedience with piety and rebellion with heresy. However, these practices did not go unchallenged. Some medieval texts, notably those by thinkers such as Peter Abelard and certain monastic communities, subtly questioned the ethical foundations of slavery and suggested that all humans possessed inherent dignity and worth, regardless of their social status. To which I say, Amen. And here's the most notable enslaved individual from the Middle Ages, Thomas de Verneuil, a French peasant whose life of bondage exemplifies the relentless hardships faced by countless enslaved people of his time. Thomas's early years were spent working the fertile lands of his family's farm, living a life marked by toil and simplicity. However, his fortunes took a drastic turn when a devastating famine struck his region. Desperate to survive, Thomas and his family were captured by a band of marauders who took them as slaves, selling them to the highest bidder across medieval Europe. Thomas's life as a slave was anything but easy. He was subjected to grueling labor on expansive estates, where the demands of his masters left little room for rest or personal freedom. Despite the oppressive conditions, Thomas maintained a resilient spirit, earning the respect of both his fellow slaves and some of his more compassionate masters through his unwavering work ethic and quiet strength. However, his relative favor did not spare him from the harsh realities of slavery. On several occasions, Thomas attempted to escape, driven by an unyielding desire for freedom, only to be recaptured and punished severely, serving as a grim reminder to others of the futility of resistance. Through the years, Thomas experienced the brutal cycles of ownership, being sold multiple times as debts were brokered and new masters sought skilled laborers. Each transfer brought new challenges, from adapting to different working conditions to navigating the ever-present threat of punishment. The psychological toll of such instability weighed heavily on him, yet Thomas found solace in small acts of defiance, sharing stories with fellow slaves, preserving snippets of his culture, and holding on to the hope of eventual liberation. But do not be fooled. Thomas de Verneuil was not an exception, and his story was far too common in the Middle Ages. The pervasive system of slavery was designed to strip individuals of their identities and autonomy, relegating them to mere property within a rigid social hierarchy. Slaves like Thomas were often kept in deplorable conditions, with little to no access to education or opportunities for advancement. This systemic oppression fostered a culture of fear and submission, discouraging any attempts at resistance and perpetuating the cycle of enslavement. In more severe cases, slaves were subjected to brutal punishments such as mutilation or public executions to instill fear and maintain order. These extreme measures were believed to reinforce the power dynamics of the feudal system and deter other potential rebellions. There was one more form of punishment for slaves in the Middle Ages, but honestly, I'm not even sure I can say what it is on YouTube, so let's just leave it at that. By the 17th century, the institution of slavery was firmly established, marking the formalization of human bondage within emerging economic and social frameworks. It was a time when colonial powers began to categorize and regulate various aspects of slavery, including the acquisition, ownership, and treatment of enslaved individuals. European traders and colonial administrators, who were instrumental in developing transatlantic slave routes, described slavery as an essential mechanism for economic expansion and societal development. They considered it a legitimate and necessary component of their colonies, justifying it as a means to sustain agricultural production and support burgeoning industries. This perspective framed slavery not merely as a social arrangement, but as an integral part of what was deemed normal economic and social order in the colonies. This was a period when economic growth and colonial expansion were prioritized, and any opposition to slavery was often suppressed or marginalized. The notion of slavery was not limited to economic or political spheres, but permeated popular culture as well. It was often portrayed in literature, art, and media of the time. Enslaved individuals were depicted in ways that emphasized their subjugation and dependence, serving to normalize and perpetuate the system of bondage. These representations justified the harsh treatments inflicted upon them and warned others against challenging the established social norms. By embedding the ideology of slavery into the cultural consciousness, it became easier to sustain and legitimize the practice across generations. The justification of slavery was further reinforced by the rise of scientific racism in the 19th century. Scholars like Samuel George Morton and Herbert Spencer propagated theories that categorized humans into different races with inherent hierarchies, labeling African slaves as naturally inferior and suited for enslavement. Spencer, for instance, argued that the progression of societies depended on the dominance of certain races, viewing slavery as a necessary institution to maintain what he considered the natural order. These theories, much like Freud's controversial ideas, were met with significant criticism and skepticism. Many contemporaries challenged the validity of racial hierarchies, arguing that they were based on biased interpretations rather than empirical evidence. Nonetheless, the prevailing pseudoscientific beliefs provided a veneer of legitimacy to the institution of slavery, making it appear as a justified and rational societal norm. This period also saw the entrenchment of laws and policies that institutionalized racial discrimination, further embedding slavery within the legal and social frameworks of the time. One influential theory was the concept of the natural order, which suggested that slavery was a divinely ordained and economically indispensable institution. Proponents argued that different races had distinct roles, with white Europeans destined to lead and African slaves to labor, thus maintaining the stability and progress of civilization. Another pervasive theory was the economic indispensability of slave labor, particularly in the agricultural sectors, such as cotton and sugar plantations. Economists and policymakers highlighted the economic benefits derived from slavery, claiming that it was essential for economic growth and the prosperity of the nation. These theories intertwined economic interests with ideological justifications, making the abolition of slavery not only a moral challenge, but also an economic threat to the existing social order. But just when the institution of slavery seemed unassailable, several critics emerged who challenged the moral and rational foundations of slavery. Abolitionists argued that slavery was inherently immoral and violated the fundamental principles of human rights and dignity. They pointed out the contradictions in justifying slavery through pseudo-scientific theories, emphasizing that these arguments were based on unfounded prejudices rather than objective truths. These critics also highlighted the economic and social inequalities perpetuated by slavery, advocating for a society where all individuals could enjoy equal rights and opportunities. Additionally, voices from within the enslaved population and sympathetic allies underscored the brutal realities of slavery, countering the sanitized narratives presented by its proponents. Despite these challenges, the entrenched economic interests and prevailing racial ideologies made the abolition of slavery a prolonged and contentious struggle. By the mid-20th century, the understanding of slavery and its enduring impacts began to evolve. The civil rights movement, along with numerous academic studies, challenged the prevailing narratives that had long justified racial inequalities. Reports and research highlighted the deep-seated socioeconomic disparities and systemic racism that persisted well beyond the formal abolition of slavery. However, remnants of discriminatory practices and institutional biases continued to be used, often subtly, to maintain control over marginalized communities. Post-war era also saw the rise of covert measures aimed at sustaining racial hierarchies, including discriminatory housing policies and employment practices. These oppressive tactics were seen as a last resort for preserving the social order, thank God. The implementation of such measures was highly controversial and often led to severe economic and psychological repercussions for affected individuals and communities. In the 1960s and 70s, the civil rights movement and other social justice movements began to directly challenge the lingering effects of slavery. Activists and scholars argued that systemic racism was used to perpetuate social control and economic exploitation of people of color. They pointed out that there was no equivalent term to describe the systemic oppression faced by marginalized groups, highlighting the double standards in societal attitudes towards different races. In the late 20th century, the concept of slavery continued to evolve, shifting focus from its historical manifestations to its modern equivalents, such as human trafficking and economic exploitation. The term slavery was increasingly seen as outdated in its traditional sense, but remained relevant in discussions about systemic injustices and racial disparities. It was recognized as a relic of a painful history that still influences contemporary societal structures and attitudes, underscoring the ongoing struggle to fully eradicate its legacy. And now, let's see what slavery is known as in the year 2024. The legal specialists of today have replaced the term slavery with modern slavery. Modern slavery is characterized by the coercive control and exploitation of individuals through deception, force, or abuse of power, severely disrupting their lives. The causes of modern slavery are multifaceted. Economic factors such as poverty and lack of opportunities, political instability, and inadequate legal protections can lead to modern slavery. One common misconception is that modern slavery is simply about having low income or being in desperate situations. However, it's much more complex than that. Modern slavery involves a coercive need for labor or exploitation that can lead to profound distress and impairment in daily life. It's not about economic necessity alone, but about being trapped in exploitative conditions with little to no ability to escape. Be sure to watch all of our documentaries, which should appear on the screen just about now. There's only 2 on the screen, but you can find more from our channel page. Let us know which documentaries you want to see next in the comment section below, and be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. History, but fast.